Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'll probably sit in the front. Once like this isn't blocking your view, you should be good. Okay, so now I will. Okay, now I'll only take 2 seconds to do a little introduction. So welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Both those of you who are live with us here in the museum and in Zoom. We are glad to have and grateful to have, I would say, author Judi Merriam with us tonight. She's a local singer, actor, director, wife and mother, and now an author. And as you've probably read on the blurb, in December 2011, her and her husband, their family's life changed forever when her 18-year-old son, Jensen, took his own life in an act that kind of surprised everybody. We were speaking a little bit earlier on, why the museum has asked her to speak here is because Ireland used to have one of the highest rates of suicide in Europe, and it's gotten a little bit better. I think there was kind of spikes during COVID, as there probably was, for everybody. There were certainly spikes after 2008. And I don't have the statistics. I think in Ireland, it's not necessarily just young people, although again, that has risen. But, things in Ireland have gotten better for maybe certain groups that might have felt marginalized. So I know some of the, the fact that Ireland voted to pass, for instance, same-sex marriage, may have taken some of the pressure off some people who felt alienated or marginalized. But, Judi will talk to you about the fact that with some people, you never know. Like Ireland has a history of alcoholism, of mental health issues. These are kind of deep in our psyche. Some people say traceable back to the Great Hunger in the 1840s. So with some people, it's very obvious. There's cries for help. There's, a history of maybe attempts or certainly mental health issues. And with about 10%, Judi was saying, that is not the case. And so tonight is not, to dwell necessarily on how we didn't see it or what should you be looking for, but I think these parents have learned, how to cope with grief and how life unfortunately does move on, but also to, share the hope maybe that's in your journey. I know in Ireland, the Pieta House movement, the Darkness into Light movement, a lot of these, great things have come out from people's worst tragedies. And so Judi's book, I think, will kind of explain her journey. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to Judi. If there's any questions on the Zoom thing, you can use the Q&A function to ask those. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I am very honored to be here tonight. Michael, I have to say you look familiar, so I'm wondering if I've seen you before. You look very familiar when you walked in, and I'm grateful for the friends who are here and those who I don't know who are on Zoom. Thank you so much for joining. And I know Elizabeth shared a little bit about me, and I was very surprised when Elizabeth called and told me that the suicide rates in Ireland were as high as they are. They have definitely gone up here in the United States during COVID, but not to the extent some other places. And I think some of the things that Elizabeth was sharing were very true. And here in the United States, I never knew much about suicide until it affected my own family. I didn't talk about it with my children. I didn't talk about it with friends. I knew one person in my entire life who had died by suicide, and that was when I was a teenager, and it was the brother of a friend, and we were never allowed to talk about it again. So it was the last thing I ever expected to affect my family. And since 2011, I have learned a lot about suicide. I have taken some classes through the American Foundation and Awareness for Suicide Prevention, always a wonderful organization for just learning things. And I know Elizabeth was telling us earlier, sharing about the stats in Ireland, but here in the United States, the stats say that it's middle-aged men who are often the highest, and then teenagers are the next group. And often girls will attempt more frequently, but it's boys who will actually complete suicide. Girls tend to do it more often for attention. Boys actually do it to just follow through and do it and to be done with it. And that was our story. And I never, ever expected that it would affect my family. And as Elizabeth shared, that out of out of people's darkness often comes light. And it never at first occurred to me to write a book, but as I would share things after our journey of first experiencing suicide in our family, I had friends that would say, why don't you write a book? And I finally did. And I kept notes for a very long time of what I was thinking. I wrote in a journal. And I actively pursued healing because I didn't want a second death in our family by my refusal to enter back into the world. And so my book, the reason I wrote was to bring redemption out of something terrible that no parent should ever have to go through. And I know Elizabeth shared about a couple of things in Ireland, the Out of the Dark walk and things like that. And I want to share with you, Brene Brown, who's one of my favorite authors, wrote, "One day you will tell your story of how you overcame what you went through, and it will become someone else's survival guide." And that is what I set out to do. I somehow knew by the grace of God, after our son took his life, that I needed to just go into the darkness as far as I needed to go in order to come to the light on the other side of the darkness. And I knew if I didn't, I wouldn't survive. And I have a deep and abiding faith in God, but that doesn't always get us through things, because there are a lot of questions about our faith when we go through something so terrible. And I started reading everything I could possibly find after our son took his life. And I discovered that most of what was out there was written by men or fathers. There were very few books written by mothers. And another reason I started writing down notes of things that I was going through and things that I was learning. And the books that I did find by mothers that were memoirs or even about suicide were not all that helpful. One mother, I read her memoir, her daughter took her life the same way our son did. And after I finished the memoir, I could tell that this mother was probably not long for the world. And soon after, she took her own life. And that's the devastation of what a suicide does to someone. And I thought, I want to be a voice that tells the truth, that is honest about what I went through, but also a voice to encourage others that in spite of the devastation, in spite of the carnage, in spite of what is left behind, there is grace, there is redemption, and there is light at the other end of the darkness, but we have to jump headfirst into that darkness and not avoid it. So I wrote so I could encourage others that there's hope, that there is light at the end of the darkness, that if we grieve well, then we can heal well. We never heal completely. The wound is never covered with a bandage that keeps it healthy, but we can go forward and we can bring light and encouragement to others. And so that's why I wrote. My book is Empty Shoes by the Door. The picture on the cover is actually my son's own shoes that still sit by my front door and always will. And my daughter, who was an art major, took the picture for me for the book. And I always knew that I wanted both his shoes and my daughter's photography on the cover of the book. And I'm so honored that way. What I'd like to do is share some of the readings from my book, and then I'll open it up for questions if anybody has questions, and let you ask me things that I might be able to encourage or help with. So, and you're kind of an experiment today. How's it feel to be an experiment? This is my first book reading. I have some others lined up possibility, but this is my first one. And I thought, wow, this is exciting. So as I sat and picked out different portions of the book to read, I tried to pick things that were both encouraging, but were also very honest, that showed the devastation, but also showed what's come out of it. And my first draft that I wrote of the book was very long and endless, and I did not know how to narrow it down into chapters, to structure it. I did not know how. I worked with a memoir coach, and she gave me all kinds of notes, page upon page of notes. I took every single one of her notes and I incorporated it. And then one day I just had the thought, as a singer, Why not separate my chapters by song titles? There is no copyright on song titles. There's copyright on everything else. Every word in here that I quoted or whatever, I had to get permission for, but I didn't have to get permission for song titles. So once I came up with the idea of song titles, then it was easy to structure the book. So all of my chapter titles are from musical theater productions that I've been in, songs from musical theater that I have performed or really enjoyed. And that was a joy to sit down and write page upon page of song titles and then figure out how I was going to structure the book that way. So that is how my book is structured. I won't read from every chapter, but the chapters that I do read from, shorter portions, I will tell you the title, the song, and then what the chapter is about, because under each of my song titles, I write just a few words to explain what the chapter is about. So I'd like to begin. My prologue is entitled, How Could I Ever Know?, which is from the musical The Secret Garden. And I'm going to read the very beginning of the prologue. Life is so very different from what I thought it would be. It's fragile and amazing and terrifying and broken and glorious and devastating all at the same time. And it can change in a matter of seconds. A breath can continue a life, or a breath can end a life. Sometimes the ending of a life or the continuing of a life comes down to a choice that should not be ours to make. On the afternoon of December 23rd, 2011, the sweetest, kindest, most loving, endlessly creative, intelligent, thoughtful, and polite young man I've ever known died by suicide and robbed my world of one of my most precious treasures. He's my son, Jensen, my second-born, blue-eyed, smiling 18-year-old. My life hasn't been the same since he left this earth, and it will never be the same again while I'm still here. This is my story of Jensen, his life, his death, and how I've survived without his physical presence throughout my days since he died. I write this so I'll never forget who he was and who I am because of him. I write so others will understand who and what I lost on that day Jensen chose to end his life. I write because he wrote, and it seems a fitting way to tell my chosen details of the intriguing, complex, brilliant, and fine young man he was, and what my survival has looked like. Jensen was a master weaver of stories and loved the written word in a most passionate way. Stories were the cornerstone of his creativity, whether in written form or in film. This isn't my husband Brian's story, or my daughter Kalina's story, or my oldest son Tyler's story. It's mine, and I'm telling it the way I think it should be told. More than anything, though, I want you to know that while I take so much time to speak of only one of my dear children, this by no means lessens the great love and admiration I have for my other two or my husband. I am most frequently their biggest champion when challenging those who would challenge them. I would willingly lay down my life for any of those dear ones in the nucleus of my present soul cluster of 4. They are my treasures, my heartbeats, my DNA of love and commitment. If you ever get to meet my amazing family, it will be a good day for you. So there are 4 of us left. There were 5 of us. Jensen was my middle child. And as hard as it is on parents to lose a child, it's equally hard for siblings in a different way. Siblings don't get the support that parents do typically. Jensen happened to be one of the 10% who gave no clues, who showed no sign of mental health issues whatsoever. And that was what the devastation was. And that's part of the devastation. That's why it was so hard to believe that he made that choice, because we couldn't say, oh my goodness, we've dealt with depression forever. Even my daughter, Kalina, who is 4 years younger than Jensen, said, Mom, I would have even thought Tyler or I would make that decision, but never Jensen. And that was what blindsided us so much. And that's what made the journey even more difficult. But we have walked through it. We have each worked on our grief in our own way. And I have to say that even my children are doing well. And I love that each of them allowed me to use them in this story. They didn't have to, but they gave me permission for that. The next portion is from my first chapter, which is Let's Hear It for the Boy, which is from the musical Footloose. And Underneath, let's hear it for the boy, is Jensen enters the world. From all observations and remembrances, Jensen's childhood seemed fairly normal, as normal goes. Our family did the regular kinds of things others list as healthy: dinners together, a good chunk of dad time, fun vacations, lots of educational opportunities, plenty of books and music, time playing outside, time to play with friends, etc. Our parenting style was stricter than some, but not as strict as that of others we knew when it came to our children's behavior and activities. We were a homeschool family, but not one that thought our children should always be at home. We purposely chose to live in an urban environment, so our children had a much more diverse view of life than what would most likely be found in a middle-class suburban white culture. Our 3 offspring were well socialized, even to the point of 1 or 2 of them occasionally asking, "Can we just stay home?" To which I would respond, "May we just stay home?" And then, "No, this activity will be a good experience." I was always on the lookout for good experiences. Isn't that one of the prerequisites for being a good parent? In my earlier years of mothering, I trained my children well in what I considered the selfless art of people-pleasing. I was a fine example to them with my own propensity for trying to be all things to all people, an exhausting and often demanding task. I later learned it's not selfless at all to agree to what everyone else wants, as my brood and I each struggle to find our own voices in the quest to make the people around us happy. Jensen chose to leave this world before he truly found his voice. Or maybe his leaving was actually the finding of that voice. Who knows? The hardest chapter for me to write probably was my second full chapter, and that was my chapter entitled Goodbye, Fair Angel, and it's about Jensen leaving this world. And so I'm not going to be reading from that, but those of you that get the book will be able to read through that. I know there are always questions about how and when and why and all of that, and I'm choosing not to read it so that you can and then answer those questions yourself. And I remember at one point when I actually told about Jensen's actual suicide, my memoir coach said, "Thank you. Everyone always wants to know that." And that's a hard thing sometimes with people when they find out about a suicide. Almost the first thing out of their mouth is, "How did he do it? How did she do it?" And often we don't want to talk about that right away. So I would encourage you, if you know of a suicide, try not to ask that question. Eventually you'll know. But right off the bat, nobody really wants to talk about that. And out of love and kindness, respect the person's privacy, the family's privacy, until they're ready to tell you. And I had to occasionally say to people, I just don't really want to talk about it, even though now I've written about it and it's not an embarrassment to me. But along with my telling my story, at the end of each chapter, I have something to consider, which is what I want to give to people who also want to help people who are grieving to know what to do or what to say or what not to do and what not to say. Because it's not just a singular journey that any of us are on. We are all in relationship somehow, and we need to be loving and kind and learn the best way to help people who are suffering from tragedy or trauma. My next portion is from my chapter 3, Before the Parade Passes By, which is from Hello, Dolly. And this chapter is about support. We had, this is before I start reading that, we had over 1,000 people attend Jensen's memorial service, and it was absolutely overwhelming. When I walked out for the service, I almost couldn't continue, and I'd never seen that many people in one place at our church before. So this portion starts after the memorial service when we were greeting people afterwards. To our utter astonishment, about 700 of those who came to the service joined us in the fellowship hall afterward. These loving and kind people formed a line so they could all take turns greeting us. That line snaked its way around the room with no end in sight. We greeted people for over 4 hours. I hadn't even smiled as much or hugged as many people at our wedding, and that had been a day of joy. How was I still smiling at people and thanking them for their love for 4 hours on a day memorializing such death and loss? Shock is the answer. Shock is always the grace that allows people to survive through early days of devastation and desperation. By the time the last of those people left, I was totally devoid of any emotion, thought, or energy. My smile was just a plaster cast by then. We'd been at church since noon or so, and it was now almost 9 p.m. How we survived that day is still astounding to me. But as William Ritter says, quote, "The same arms that catch the dying also carry the living," end quote. We were carried by God's mercy and grace and the love of all who showed up to walk through that service with us. Gratitude intermingled with my pain at that realization. I quote many people in the book, and the quotes are from books that I read along my journey. At the end, I also have a resource page of books to read for people. But William Ritter is a gentleman who allowed me to quote him, and I could not have lived at first without his book. He lost his adult son when the son was, I believe, 42. And out of his grief and his pain, he wrote a book. And that book then ministered to me and my grief and my pain. Again, the survival guide that we share with other people so we can get through just terrible things. My chapter 4 is a chapter entitled Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered. And that's called Cleaning Up. This is a situation at the bank where I'm trying to close out Jensen's bank account. I start with, in the Heaven Sent season 9 episode of Doctor Who, the doctor tells us that the day we lose a loved one isn't the worst because at least we have something to do that day. However, he then continues with this thought, it's all the days they stay dead. What would I now do with all the days ahead that Jensen stayed dead? Cleaning up would only last so long, and then what? Shock was still calling the shots, so I just did the next thing and helped Brian with whatever he needed to do in order to obtain the closure of Jensen's paperwork. A challenge indeed. Bureaucracy offers no pity in loss, not even the loss of a child. None of the people with whom we dealt extended any compassion over Jensen's death, when our reason for contending with his paper trail was verbalized by our grieving parent lips. Brian took care of the bulk of the rest of Jensen's financial paperwork while I offered to go to the bank and close out his savings account. We decided to empty his passbook by transferring the money into Kalina's account. Later, we would give Tyler half of the money, but at the time, it was easier just to think about closing all of Jensen's accounts as quickly as possible. The teller at the bank where he had his savings was insistent on knowing why I was closing the account. I can't close out this account without a reason, I was told. I responded, I just need to close it. I understand that, but I need a reason for doing so, she said. You can't just please close it at my request, I replied with a bit more agitation. Ma'am, I need to write down the reason for doing so. I don't understand why a reason has anything to do with it. It's my son's saving account, and I just want to close it and transfer the money into my daughter's account. The form requires I put down a reason. I need to write something on the line that asks for that, she said in a somewhat more callous tone. We had a brief visual standoff while my eyes filled with tears, and I finally blurted out more loudly than I intended, because he's dead, is that reason enough for you? Customers at other windows and employees behind the counter were now staring at me. Perhaps had I put my hand in my pocket at that moment, they would have all fallen to the floor, fearing what I planned to pull out and point at the teller at whom I was glaring so despairingly. But my teller continued gawking at me and said nothing, as if my words didn't compute in her bureaucratic brain. I was just about ready to plead for the branch manager's help when her mouth finally opened and she uttered something, but never an apology for any of it, not even, I'm so sorry for the loss of your son. And that was quite typical of the things that we had to do afterwards. And one of the things I want to encourage all of you, if you have children who are 18 and older, please make sure they have a will. It is imperative that they have a will. They might have very little to make a decision about, but if they have a will, when they die, if they die, it makes life a little more simple for trying to clean up everything after them. Jensen didn't have a will. It didn't occur to us that Jensen needed a will. But if he had had a will, it would have been an easier journey just cleaning up the mess afterwards. And that's something that I suggest, and there's something to consider at the end of that chapter. Please make sure when your children are 18, they have a will as soon as they turn 18. And you can bet that our oldest and our daughter, very shortly after that, our oldest was already older than 18, but as soon as our daughter turned 18, she had a will. And we gave her the choice of how she wanted to fill that out. My next portion that I would like to read is from a chapter entitled, "What is this feeling?" which is from the musical Wicked. And underneath that, this is about grief. In his book, Understanding Your Suicide Grief, Alan D. Wolfelt tells us grief and mourning are not the same things. He defines grief as the compilation of thoughts and feelings that welled up within you when you first encountered this painful loss, and that remain inside you as you cope with changes that this loss has brought in your life. However, he goes on to say that mourning is actively and purposefully moving grief from the inside to the outside and expressing it externally. I want to be known as a woman who has both grieved and mourned well, for without both, there can be no rescue and recovery from the abyss of despair. And the ache of grief does indeed feel like an abyss at times. But I'm here to tell you there is a goodly measure of deliverance when grief is owned, faced, and turned into active, healthy mourning. I've worked hard to impel my grief from the inside to the outside, and I will most likely have to keep working at it for the rest of my life. For grief, as it progresses, is like the ever-changeable weather where one day it's dark and rainy, and the very next day the sky can open up clear and beautiful. In the reality of my grief and mourning, I acknowledged every bit of both, the dark and rainy emotions, as well as the clear and beautiful ones, no matter how, when, or where those opposites affected me. And I need to tell you, they still do affect me, just not in the extremes the way they once did. I do, however, understand why some people walk away from a loved one's suicide without ever looking back at that event again. It must appear easier to deal with reality that way. Transformation and change can be really difficult and uncomfortable. But walking away and pretending as suicide didn't happen doesn't allow us to take control of our grief and pain on our own terms. C.S. Lewis declares, there is nothing we can do with suffering except to suffer it. Grief demands we have to suffer. Healing demands we have to own that suffering. There comes a point when the only way through and forward in our healing is to stop thinking and living like a victim and become a survivor instead. I'm not saying it's wrong to be a victim. We can't be a survivor if we were never a victim in the first place. Continuous victim mentality, however, doesn't trudge through the hard and demanding work of healing. The father of Columbine's Rachel Scott speaks this to us out of his own grief journey. You have to learn to see through the event and not get stuck in it. Forever remaining a victim is passive, whereas becoming a survivor is active and progressive. If we're going to persist and endure, we have to own the work involved in surviving beyond the trauma or tragedy that makes us a victim in the first place. We do need initial victim time so healing can begin with the acceptance of our loss, but it's essential we venture on to become a survivor in order to live in and through the redemption that can lead us out of our miserable circumstances. We can run from grief, but we can never escape it, nor can we ignore it, try as we may. Grief will always catch up with us eventually, and if we don't stand face to face with it and admit the truth about our brokenness, we can't heal. And if we don't face it sooner rather than later, it will be worse later and leave even more carnage in its wake. We have to deal with grief, or it will deal with us in ways that are unhealthy, ways that take their toll on our well-being and the well-being of those whom we love. I do believe that I'm here reading from my book because I have grieved well, because I've done the hard work, because I haven't just walked away from it or shriveled into a little ball or said, I'm not going to deal with it, or I'm going to pretend it's better than it is. And I can attest to the fact that because I have done the hard work, that I have the ability now to look grief in the face and stand with it and say, you are not going to take me down. You are not going to ruin my life anymore. And I am going to go out and tell my story so that others will know how to fight grief and work their way through grief. Just looking here, I believe this is from, this is my chapter where I'm probably going to get flack from people whose names I didn't use, but I've told some stories about them. This is entitled Dogs in the Yard, which is from the musical Fame. And it's about the expectations of others. And it's really hard to deal with grief and wrong expectations that are placed on people. We all do it. And we have to really be careful of that. And I've learned along the way to check my own expectations of people and try not to place what I assume is correct or what I think they should be doing on them, because everyone deals so differently in grief, and grief is such an individual journey. I'm looking to see where. One of the more difficult expectations catching me completely off guard was that it seemed we should have recovered by the end of the first year after Jensen's death. When we attended church the Sunday after arriving back from Grand Cayman, Brian took us to Grand Cayman on the first anniversary of Jensen's death and Christmas, so we did not have to live through that in our house. People actually teased Brian about having pneumonia on our trip. He spent most of his time in the hospital. There were jokes about him wanting extra attention or that he had to be in the limelight or other surprisingly flippant comments. No one said, I'm so very sorry you were sick at such a difficult time for your family. That was when it appeared that compassion for our grief had pretty much ended now that we lived through a full year of no Jensen. I guess we were allotted 365 days, and those days were done. No one seems to speak precise words that give away their thoughts about such, but I sensed a definite shift in behavior from many who knew us. Their actions demonstrated that our grief grace period was over. What those who've not suffered the loss of a child don't seem to comprehend, though, is the truth of Jerry Sitzer's words. Sorrow never entirely leaves the soul of those who have suffered a severe loss. Since by the second year we were supposed to be better, over it, or back to normal, much of the support and encouragement ended, according to people's misconceptions about the length and intensity of grief. However, the second year was more emotionally difficult for me than the first. I'd held my breath and treaded water for the previous 12 months, hoping I wouldn't drown in grief and sorrow as I counted down through 365 days of survival. Now I face that second year with the reality of Jensen never returning, hitting my brain like the inhale of icy air in sub-zero temperatures. And even though I'd read that after a death, the second year may well be harder than the first, I wasn't prepared for how challenging it truly would be. After shouldering up to endure all the firsts of a life without our middle child, my guard was down when the actuality of his special dates were upon us again, and he was still missing, nor would he ever be with us in all our days left on earth. Admitting that truth felt like a tree falling across my chest, suffocating my breath. But I mostly kept this to myself. Whereas the first year had been defined by survival, that second year would be defined by the stark reality of acceptance. One of the things I do that brings me redemption is when I hear of a suicide or read about a suicide in a paper, and I can almost always tell from an obituary the way it's worded. And people reach out to me frequently to tell me about suicides. I try to reach out to the mother of, especially if it's a younger person, a teenager. I try to reach out to the mother and establish a relationship because I couldn't find anybody. My first year, there was nobody. I didn't know anybody. I had to go looking for everything on my own. And I try now to reach out to mothers so I can tell them, I know exactly how you feel. I know what you're going through. And I know how awful it is, but I'm here 10 years down the road. And I can tell you that if you can get through each moment of each day, you will eventually be where I am, and you will see that you will have lived 10 years down the road. And one of the things that I always tell these moms is that this first year's terrible, but be prepared, because you think you will make it through the second year a little more easily, but the second year is almost always harder because you've gone through everything the first year, but now in the second year, the reality of never having that person back in your life, especially if it's a child, hits in a greater way than the first year, because the first year you're just trying to make it through, but the second year you realize it's never going to be different. And I count it an honor and a privilege to sit with those moms and to be there for them and encourage them and walk with them through their own pain. I have way too many things for reading, so I'm going to skip over a few, but this is from my chapter 9, Moments in the Woods, about parenting, and Moments in the Woods is from the musical Into the Woods. Motherhood isn't just a series of contractions. It's a state of mind from the moment we know life is within us. We feel a responsibility to protect and defend that human being. It's a promise we can't keep, says Irma Bombeck. And now these are my words. We think we can protect, guide, and direct our children far more than we really can. We think we can control their environment and circumstances so as to give them a greater hope and future than we had. We think they'll keep listening to us for as long as we keep speaking, but the reality is they won't. My children grew up and began making some very distinct choices and decisions contrary to the things they'd been taught and told. I'm not a bad parent because your children behave better than mine do at times. You're not a good parent because your children sometimes make better choices than mine. So many of us are doing the best we can, trying to do a better job than our own parents did. We really, truly are. And the generational reality is that we can only do so much. And then choices are left up to those bundles of love, energy, blood, and bones birthed out of our own bodies. They'll make decisions that shake us to the core and rock our worlds in ways we never even imagined. They're their own persons with their own personalities and proclivities. We are not the God in our children's lives we think we are or try to be. I became a much more gracious and loving mother when I accepted my children as they are and stopped trying to make them into what I or other people thought they should be. That's God's job, not mine. Love will have the final word, and that final word is not mine. This is my chapter entitled We Make a Beautiful Pair. That is from the musical Shenandoah, and this is about my husband, Brian, because men and women grieve very differently, and the divorce rate is very high amongst parents who lose a child to suicide. I don't know the exact stats, but I do know it's extremely high, and I understand that because it's a horrible thing for parents to go through. And I think one of the reasons Brian and I, right from the beginning, were okay with each other was, first of all, we had so much love and support from people, but also so many people were praying for us. But also, Brian and I never placed any expectation on each other. We had no idea how we were supposed to grieve. So none of us, or neither of us, ever got to the point where we said, you know, you need to be over this now, or I don't really know why you're still crying. And I've heard that from other parents who struggle in their marriage relationship after trying to just figure out how to let each other grieve. But there never came a point where Brian and I said that to each other. And although we grieved differently, it did not become a problem in our marriage. And I will always be thankful about this. And this is my something to consider at the end of my portion on We Make a Beautiful Pair, just for anyone who is dealing with grieving together as spouses over the death of a child. Grieving spouses need to extend much grace to each other after their child chooses suicide. They need to cling together in their pain and at the same time allow for individual ways of healing. They will seldom be consistently grieving in the same manner at the same time. Therefore, one may appear healthier at times, but it's typically a shifting of steps forward and steps backward for both, no matter which spouse may appear, quote, better at any given moment. Our personalities determine much of what our grief walk will look like. One walk is not necessarily better and the other worse. It's just what it is and changes from day to day. Sometimes we can't see how our grief journeys balance each other out until we're several years down the road from the epicenter of our trauma. Great quantities of patience and love are required for walking the parental suicide survivor road as a couple, but even then there may be doubts. Hold on to each other as tightly as possible. It's a roller coaster ride where if one falls out of the car, the other has to be the hand that grabs so as to keep the faller from hitting the ground at full gravitational grief speed. This is no simple or easy task at times, but it can be done and it's worth the fight for your relationship of love. I will always be thankful for the grace that we gave each other for the grief period that was especially so difficult. And that wasn't something that we read, it was just something that I consider the grace of God. This is from my chapter entitled, Let Me Entertain You. And that is from, I believe, the musical Gypsy. And it's about socializing. Socializing changes after a suicide, especially the closer we are to the suicide. Meeting someone for the first time is usually the most unnerving if the introductory conversation moves to questions about children or my immediate family. When we begin talking about our lives, the topic of parenting almost always comes up if the other person is a parent too. This typically leads to the number of children we have, and then on to the inevitable questions of how old they are and what they do. What do I say? If I choose to be honest about having 3 children, the unavoidable query of ages and job choices comes next. My reality is that I have 1 oldest child, 1 youngest child, and a dead middle child whose age is younger than his little sister's present age. The telling of this brings about that ever-present puzzled look and questioning, oh, from my listener, and then my perplexity about what to say next. However, if I say I only have 2 children, that's a lie and seems disloyal to Jensen, who, although no longer present in body, is one of those 3 much loved and cherished creations birthed from my own body. If I say Jensen was 18 when he died, the next customary question is how he died. When the word suicide or phrase, he took his life, is mentioned, the discomfort of the questioner becomes palpable. I want to speak the truth. I'm not ashamed of Jensen's death by suicide. It's the person asking questions who becomes uncomfortable with the truth of my life. I don't want to hide anything, and I'm not looking for pity or sympathy. I don't want to cause them discomfort either, though, so this whole topic of family size or jobs becomes a person-by-person decision based on circumstances and my discernment of the respected doggedness of the one asking me questions. And that has actually improved as time has moved away from our son's suicide, just because I care less about making people comfortable all the time, which is just part of the journey. But when I was closer to it, and the pain was written all over my face on a regular basis, I was more cautious about what I say because I didn't want to upset people. But now it's kind of, here I am reading you my book about my son's suicide. So it is what it is. And that has been tremendously freeing, I have to say. The next portion is from my chapter entitled Waiting for the Light to Shine, from the musical Big River. And underneath it, it's about how I've changed. There are some lingering anxiety issues from Jensen's suicide I never had before he died. Although I regularly got nervous at auditions and when performing, I was never particularly much of a worrier or riddled with anxiety. Now, however, I sometimes deal with what Brian and I label as residual panic. This is a feeling that's often just below the surface of daily living, resulting from sojourning through the reality of a loved one's unsuspected and totally out of the blue society. Suicide. An example would be the night I attended an Advent service at a local college. I told Brian where I was, but he thought I was at a different location. When I failed to show up where he expected I'd be, he texted me, "Where are you?" It was an hour later when I read the text and thought, Brian never asks me where I am when I've told him where I'm going. There must be something wrong. What could possibly be wrong? Oh, dear Lord, Kalina, Tyler. And my mind took off in a whirl. Those feelings of memory panic consumed my brain as I called him to find out what was wrong. In actuality, there was nothing wrong whatsoever. He actually had forgotten where I was going, and a simple miscommunication had caused latent residual panic to rise to a fevered pitch in my questioning brain. These happenings don't occur often, but when they do, it's almost impossible to rein in my emotions and think clearly at that particular moment. And apparently it's not just parents who think that. After my oldest, who's now 33, read my memoir. My daughter has not read it yet, and that's fine. I'm not even going to ask her if she reads it. It's totally up to her. You know, her pain is her own, and I don't want to add more pain to her life. But my oldest read it, and he said he's so he's so understood that portion there, because there are times when he gets a phone call from either Brian or me, and he panics just when we don't say what it is. So I try to always say why I'm calling, and it's that leftover from the panic of the trauma at first. One of my chapters is entitled "They All Laughed," and it's about laughter, because laughter is a wonderful gift. And laughter saved us many, many times in the first year, the second year, and even now. And our family just laughs a lot. And I want to read a portion just from my chapter on laughter. One of the ways our family functions is through laughter. We laugh at each other, at both the things we do and the jokes we make. We laugh at the people around us. Yes, sometimes we make fun of you, and it lifts our spirits. We laugh watching Jensen's videos over and over again. We laugh at situations both ludicrous and unsolvable. We laugh at ourselves. We laugh as much as we can, and it feels really good to do so. And that is true. Laughter is a tremendous gift. The Bible tells us it's good medicine, and it is. And my something to consider at the very end of my chapter on laughter is this: don't ever feel guilty about your laughter in the midst of your grief journey. You aren't being disloyal to the person who died. Laughter is a grace that allows us relief from our pain. Laugh often and laugh a lot, even through your tears. Nowhere is it written you can't laugh and cry at the same time. Sometimes the only way we can get from our moment of where we are to our moment of where we need to be is by doing both in sync. I highly recommend laughter. Our Jensen did everything to make people laugh and be funny. And so we carry on his legacy by laughing as much as we can. My second to the last chapter is Climb Every Mountain from The Sound of Music, and it's about survival. And I want to share one funny Jensen story with you right before I close with my last little portion. At the beginning of each chapter, I have a vignette about Jensen, something that fits with the chapter. And that is how I wanted people to remember him, because part of the journey of losing a child to suicide is when people are uncomfortable and stop saying that child's name over and over again, or talking about that child. They think they're doing us a favor. They think they're doing us a grace, but it's not. We think about Jensen every day, no matter whether somebody mentions him or not. So I encourage people to talk about whoever has died to their friends, because that's an important part of a parental grief journey. It's not a favor to never mention a person who's died ever again. And if somebody's upset about it, they'll let you know, but make the assumption that parents really like to talk about their children, both dead and living. And this is the story that I shared as my last funny story about Jensen. Water skiing is one of my great delights. Our summer cabin neighbors got me up on skis when I was 6 years of age, and I've absolutely loved it for all my summers since then. Of course, Brian and I taught our own three to water ski when they were younger. It seemed a prerequisite for enjoyment at a lake abode. Two hated it and one liked it. He still does. Jensen happened to be one of the two. As determined as my middle and youngest were to not enjoy water skiing, I was equally resolute that it was only possible for them to like it when they improved and were good enough to pop out of the water and circle our lake several times. Therefore, every time Brian, Tyler, and I skied, Jensen and Kalina were expected to do so too. I did everything I could to help them get up and stay up. I got in the water with them. I gave instructions from the boat. I had them try different length skis. I sat on the dock to see if starting from there was easier. I cheered, I scolded, never an effective method. And I promised they'd love it if they would only stick with it. Nothing I did helped much at all, and enthusiasm waned. It would be Brian who held the magic key to Jensen finally getting up and staying on top of the water for a good long ski. One day he offered to get in the water and help. I drove the boat and Kalina spotted. With Jensen's watery yell of, okay, I increased our speed while continuously swiveling my head to alternate between watching my son and watching where I was driving. In one of my front-facing moments, I heard Kalina yell, Mom, Jensen lost his bathing suit. Sure enough, Jensen was wearing nothing. But he was out of the water and skiing with a huge smile of utter delight plastered on his face at both his accomplishment and his nakedness. I headed out to the middle of the lake where I hoped no one could see anything other than my son's tan line, enthusiasm and embarrassment, and hope that no one had their binoculars out. From the water behind us, Brian waved Jensen's bathing suit in the air like the flag of success it was at that moment, while Jensen made it around the middle of the lake a few times before I headed toward shore and he let go near our dock. Since naked water skiing isn't particularly appreciated or accepted by anyone watching, Jensen's career for such was short-lived. His preference lay with tubing, where speed was the key and bathing suits were necessary for non-chafing survival. Sometimes it's survival that calls the shots. And that's my chapter on survival. And I want to just read what I said about survival here. Survival isn't a one-size-fits-all commodity. Sometimes it's a fly by the seat of your pants dance that leaves you flat on the floor when your feet slip out from under you on the glossiness of cheap promises from both others and your own brain. Sometimes it's a wrong turn because one direction looks easier to navigate than the other one that demands more work. Sometimes it's just listening to whichever voice speaks the loudest in your head at any particular moment. And sometimes it's found in the simple beauty of the things that consistently allowed you to survive life from day to day before death changed your future. Just checking the timer. Oh, it's getting late. So I think I will leave it with the laughter about Jensen's water skiing. My final chapter is Tomorrow Shall Be My Dancing Day, Endings and Beginnings. And that's just where I talk about where I want to go from here and what I hope to do and other ways that I've changed too. And my goal to encourage and bring hope to others by my own survival and the things that I've learned in this journey that have changed me and changed my family. So thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, I would be honored to ask any questions whatsoever. I tell people no questions are too hard. I'm not ashamed. I'm not embarrassed, anything. So bring on the questions.
Thank you. I'll just check on my notice. Does anyone in here have a question or a comment? For Judi. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for sharing your journey. We should have said it at the start. We are very sorry for both your loss. And
Thank you, Elizabeth. You said that when you emailed
good,
me
yeah,
first.
yeah. Well, so I have lost two friends, not to suicide, thank God. They were ill. We were very young. We were in our 20s, and part, I think, of what you were talking about tonight resonates with me for their parents too. So I think this is not just, a suicide story, but I think a parental grief, a friend grief. Both of those marriages did not survive. So a lot of what you said, was kind of, as I say, resonant for me. And I think it's important. The Irish people tend to deal with grief quite well sometimes, but we were talking earlier, suicide is a tricky one because it was against church teaching. And so Ireland has come on a long way, and Catholic teaching since the Vatican II. But it can be difficult, I think, for people, as you said, to, deal with it or to talk about it. People are uncomfortable around this topic. And that's why I thought it was very important that we did deal with it, because the rates can be quite high in Ireland. And we've had a lot of suffering in the last 2 years with COVID and everything. So I think Irish people are normally quite open to grief. We do a 3-day wake. There's a lot of...
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's the facility to try to help and to encourage storytelling. So it wasn't that I necessarily wanted to shine a light on suicide, although one of my great friends, Joan Freeman, did set up Pieta House at home in Ireland, and when her sister committed suicide, absolutely fantastic work. So, I champion your work is fantastic. I hope this book will be of huge help for, as I say, not just the parents of suicide takers, or but any parents that has lost a child, and anybody who has lost a friend. So I think, that grief journey is very important to talk about. It's, not just the Irish, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Judi, talk to us about the terminology of suicide.
Can I just repeat the question in case I didn't hear? So
Yes.
There was a question, would Judi speak about the terminology around suicide?
Yes, and this is not a criticism at all of Elizabeth.
Mm-hmm.
That the one thing we discovered after our son took his life, that the suicide awareness groups are trying to lose
Not
the word
use that.
committed.
Yeah.
And the reason is that committed makes it sound like a crime.
Yeah.
And well, it is a crime, yes. And I was in a class one day, yes, where I was in a suicide awareness prevention class, and somebody asked the teacher that we know that it's supposedly illegal to take your life. So who gets charged for that?
Yeah,
So
I never knew that.
yes, and it is considered a crime. They haven't changed all that yet, but they're trying to lose the word committed.
Yeah, they are in Ireland.
Which is really, we've used that word for forever and ever and ever. They're trying to lose the stigma of the fact that it's a crime.
Mm-hmm.
And so now they encourage people to say someone took their life. You can even take suicide and turn it into a verb now and say they suicided.
Mm-hmm.
Or the term that Brian and I use probably more, if we don't say our son took his life, we say he either died by suicide or completed suicide.
Mm-hmm.
That's another term that they use now. And I do talk about that in here in the beginning. There were so many more things I could have spoken about. So I hope you don't take that as a,
No.
I know.
And I'm glad you did, Brian. When we had a suicide in my extended family in 2020, and my sister doesn't say commit suicide. She says, I think, he died by suicide is what they're, so yes. I know in Ireland there is this, movement too. And I think that's actually very important.
Well, yes, because again, and I don't think we think about those things until we've actually had a suicide in the family. But another thing they encourage now is somebody not using the term, was he successful at his suicide? Because there's nothing successful about suicide at all, but that's terminology that you hear too, and that suicide awareness groups are trying to put by the wayside and not use things like that again. So.
Okay. Thank you, Brian, that was good. I think, when our family friend, or when he was a member of the extended family, when he committed suicide, I remember writing to his wife to say, that unfortunately grief is the price you pay for love. And so there is this, not that it's ever positive to go through the grief, but that is the thing, like that you're keeping them alive. And I remember my friend's mom told me that for her, it wasn't the day of the death, it was the date of her birthday. Like today she would be 40, or like if somebody else got married or had kids, and she said her own friends, with their children aging, she was never invited to weddings, or they didn't like to talk, in the office at work about their daughter because, that would remind you that Maura is not, here. And she said, that's terrible. Like, I know their kids are alive, and I know that my daughter is gone, and it doesn't stop life moving on. And you want to be still part of it, and so I think all of those where people are trying to feel their way about trying to be gentle, but maybe sometimes being gentle means like ignoring it, which is not the right thing to do. And so, yeah.
You are so right about that,
Yeah.
Elizabeth. And
Yeah.
that is a big thing. People don't know what to say.
Yeah.
So often they don't say anything.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
but then even in my chapter on expectations of others, I talk about just, if you're going to have festivities and you're inviting someone who, is
Mhm.
grieving, give them the option to come or not to come.
Mhm.
Allow them to make the choice. Don't
Mhm.
make the choice for them.
And leave them out.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is further isolation.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's suicide is just one of those topics that is so
Mhm.
difficult.
Mhm.
Death is difficult,
Mhm.
but suicide is even more, and people
Yeah.
without thinking cause more hurt.
Yeah.
But if they just talked about it or asked the person how they feel about it,
Yeah.
it opens doors.
Yeah. And I think, you were speaking earlier on too, it put me in mind. My friend's mother loves both of them, actually. Eileen and Mary both love talking about their daughters. And I think the husbands in both cases kind of don't, like they just deal with it differently. It's, they would rather not be. Maybe it's a reminder every time. And so when you talked about, you guys mourning differently, the way I handled it was just to kind of suss it out. You'd go to the house, and to be honest, most of the time the father would leave us in the sitting room on our own, and then we could talk. And I would just I think it's good to ask questions, as opposed to telling them, so I just, how are you? Or I remember one time I went back with photographs that I had taken, Maura and I lived together in Dublin, and I had photographs to give her mom, so if she didn't want to look at them, she didn't have to, but we ended up, having the afternoon together and talking. And so if you kind of leave it open-ended, I think for the griever to say like, I can't today, or I don't want to look at those photographs, can I have them for a few weeks to look at them, that kind of thing. And so try to allow the griever to set the space, and the pace.
And that's, I say that too in here in
Yeah.
one of my, something to consider, let the grieving parent decide.
How much.
Yes, or where
Mhm.
the conversation is going to go.
Mhm,
Look
mhm.
at their body language,
Yeah.
all kinds of things like that.
And people do, like, she'll answer you in a one-word syllable, or she'll give a paragraph,
Yeah.
So like if they're wanting to talk, they'll talk, yeah. And I think, we need to be more, which I think is where Irish people are good, because we're chatty Cathys anyway, but like the community do go to, funerals and wakes. And so I think talking is very important. We're hopefully listening is equally important, mind you. But I think, my dad always says, that first month you're super busy, everyone is calling, even maybe the first year, but like people forget after a month or after 2 months, and it might be someone's birthday, or it might be the day that they were scheduled to go someplace together, or and so Dad always says, like, it's great those 3 days of the funeral, great, but keep coming, because people are left on their
very
own.
true,
Yeah.
very true. And
Yeah.
I talk about the women who still send me cards on Jensen's
Yeah.
birthday or his death date, and
Yeah.
or call me up or text me,
Yeah.
and how much that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm checking, there's nobody on Zoom commenting, just everyone's, I think it's a difficult. Does anyone in the audience want to say anything? Or share? No. So, it's a deeply personal story, but the sad thing, is it's a universal story too, as we were talking about the statistics, very, very high, shocking in America. The girls, and quite young people. I know there was a young Irish American girl who was being bullied in Boston, and so I suppose we should just look out for our younger people. I know in Ireland it tends to be more men, as you said, that are that actually carry out the deed, as opposed to women, but it's on the rise, I think, places, and it's or the help, so we've got the Samaritans, you've got Solace House here, which is part of that Pieta House movement. There's loads of different, we call them suicide prevention or intervention programs at home in Ireland, and there are here too, so I would encourage people, if you are knowing someone who's, in trouble, reach out, and there are plenty of, and you have a list in your book too of the resources that are available for people.
Yeah,
So I
so
think that's
one thing
important.
that you said, Elizabeth, you and I talked about it, and
Mhm.
Brian earlier, that people are sometimes afraid to talk about suicide with their children or whatever, because they think they're going to give ideas.
Mhm, mhm.
When our son took his life, our oldest went on websites. There are websites everywhere or how
How to
people,
do.
how to take your life.
Mhm.
So with the internet, our children can find anything they want.
Yeah.
And one of my regrets is that we never talked to our kids about suicide because it never occurred
Heard,
to
yeah.
us. And the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention is very much supportive of talking about it.
Mhm.
Talking about it does not increase the numbers.
Mhm.
It just opens up the dialogue
Mhm.
and makes it easier for a child to talk to parents if they are having suicidal ideation or any of that
Mhm,
too.
mhm. And that, I mean, light disinfects, right? And so,
Yes.
turn on a light and reach out and talk. So thank you very much. I know it was, as I say, deeply personal, but such a universal story too. Thank you for our audience for tuning in. People on Zoom, if you have any questions or comments, you can email in during the week. We will have copies of the book in store and it will be available on Amazon, I think, in the next week or two. And as I said, we might even try and link some of those resources on our website too. So thank you all for tuning in, and thank you guys for coming out. And thank you, Judi. It was fantastic.